This evening's seminar is held on the homelands of the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, along with the elders of other communities who may be here today. I'd like to give a warm welcome to friends of the library, Grattan Institute members and tonight's speakers, Dr. Heather Holst, Jenny Smith, Brendan Coates and Peter Mayers. I'm pleased to be here this evening to welcome you all to this important conversation addressing how governments can help struggling Australians with rising housing costs and reduce the number of Australians who are homeless. A 2018 street count found almost 400 people were sleeping rough across 5 inner Melbourne council areas, and many of them are on the waiting list for public housing. There were 279 rough sleepers counted in the city of Melbourne alone. In my years working within the library sector, I've become acutely aware of how tough life can be for the homeless and how important free and safe public spaces like libraries are to those who have so little they can call their own. Libraries play a hugely important role in the lives of the financially disadvantaged and the homeless. Libraries don't require a cash transaction to use and are blind to the social status of their clientele. At state and local libraries, people are able to access physical and digital resources and free or low-cost programs and services, including information technology, which has become so vital in accessing government services. They're able to do this in a supported environment with library staff at hand to help. Libraries encourage social inclusion and a community engagement. They're places that can and do give our most vulnerable a leg up to improve their situations, or at the very least, somewhere to shelter against the elements and harsh realities of social isolation. Ideally, no one would experience homelessness. In a world where they do, it's important to consider libraries as critical supports for those doing it tough. But perhaps we can work towards stopping homelessness before it begins. I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel tonight about the best ways to help low-income earners deal with rising housing costs and to reduce homelessness. It's such an important issue, and I'm delighted that State Library Victoria's partnership with the Grattan Institute continues to deliver these forward-looking conversations. Leading tonight's discussion is Peter Mayers. Peter is the author of No Place Like Home, Repairing Australia's Housing Crisis, published last year by Text. Peter is lead moderator with the Cranlana Institute for Ethical Leadership, an independent, not-for-profit organisation dedicated to developing the ethical decision-making skills of Australia's leaders. He's also an adjunct fellow in the Centre for Urban Transitions at Swinburne University and a regular contributor to Inside Story magazine. Previously, Peter worked for 25 years as a journalist and broadcaster with the ABC. Please welcome Brendan, Heather, Jenny and Peter.
Thanks very much, Helena, and thank you to the Grattan Institute for inviting me to chair this discussion. Actually, they didn't invite me, I pushed my way in. I saw the advertisement, said I want to be part of this, so thank you very much. I'll introduce you a bit more to our panellists in a moment, but I just want to make some comments about the public debate about Australia's housing market because it reminds me of Said Hanrahan by the bush poet John O'Brien. The farmer Hanrahan is chatting with his neighbours outside church and talking of the weather, of course, and there's been a long dry spell and Hanrahan says, "If we don't get 3 inches, man, or 4 to break this drought, we'll all be ruined," said Hanrahan, "before the year is out." A few weeks later, of course, the rains come and when the farmers gather, Hanrahan has new cause for despair. "And every creek a banker ran and dams filled over top, we'll all be ruined," said Hanrahan, "if this rain doesn't stop." Now, in 2017, we panicked that the real estate boom would never end. In 2018, we panicked that house prices were crashing. Now, with the RBA lowering interest rates and APRA relaxing its prudential lending requirements, analysts are predicting property values will resume their upward trajectory. And in terms of housing affordability, affordable housing, this is a tragedy. What generally gets overlooked in terms of our public debate about housing is that for Australians on low incomes, the housing crisis is not some eventuality to be feared down the track, but a reality to be lived through every day. And it can be a deadly reality, as the tragic death of Courtney Heron has reminded us in recent days. And as we have this discussion, our thoughts are with Courtney Heron and her family and her friends. Half of all low-income households in the private rental market are already living in housing stress, that is, spending more than 30% of their disposable income on rent, which doesn't leave enough, and often much more than that, which doesn't leave enough for other essentials. Homelessness is on the rise, and the share of social housing has been in decline for decades. So there's a powerful argument that government should do more to help Australia's most disadvantaged citizens to find secure and appropriate housing. And the question for this policy pitch is, what is the best and most effective way to do so? So let me introduce our three panellists a bit more detail. Jenny Smith is the chair of Homelessness Australia, the peak national body providing advocacy for the homelessness sector. She's had a career beginning in social work and family therapy, but over 30 years of professional life in the public sector, in leadership roles, in policy management, government training and service delivery, including in the health and community sectors. Dr. Heather Holst is the inaugural Commissioner for Residential Tenancies in Victoria, and she has almost 30 years' experience working in the housing, tenancy and homelessness sectors. Before taking up the role of Commissioner, she was Deputy CEO and Chief Operating Officer of Launch Housing, one of Victoria's or one of Australia's leading community housing providers. And Brendan Coates is the Australian Perspectives Fellow at the Grattan Institute, and he's an economist, and his research focuses on a number of things: tax reform, economic and budgetary policy, retirement incomes and superannuation. It's got him in an argument with Paul Keating, and cities and housing. So welcome to you all. And our format is a discussion, no PowerPoints. And after 45 minutes of us talking, I'm going to invite your comments and questions from the floor. If you haven't done so already, put your mobile phone on silent, etc. And this is being recorded as a podcast, and a transcript as well will go on the Grattan Institute website. So let's start by establishing the scale of the problem, the extent of the problem. Jenny, how would you characterise the size of the problem we face?
Well, we've got two major sources of data that we refer to regularly. One is the census that happens every 5 years, and last time those figures were counted in 2016. We had more than 116,000 people every night in this country who are homeless. The other important data that we look at all the time is the number of people fronting up to our specialist homelessness services around the country looking for assistance. And the last full set of figures for that was in excess of 288,000 different people every year. And when you think that those services are turning away more than 260 people a day, it's a very, very significant problem in this very wealthy country.
So it's interesting, that 116,000 figure, because it doesn't seem that big in one way. As a proportion of the population, it's tiny. But in fact, it's not a fixed population, is it? It's people moving in and out of that. So if the ripple effect is much larger than that.
Yes, that's a point in time. Yeah. That's, one night. And it's obviously an interesting count. And while the, one night figures supplemented by some surveying by the ABS, it's still a point in time, any day. And I think the figure of people making it through all the other service systems in our community, hospitals, other community services, to our specialist homelessness system, 288,000 different people. It's huge.
Heather, how would you characterise the problem or the extent of the problem?
I think Jenny's put the figures that we know very clearly. I would say, I suppose, Peter, why wouldn't it be getting worse? Because there really isn't anything effective and sustained being done about it. So we know that Australia's, growing. Melbourne is a great example of that. And yet social housing, particularly public housing, absolutely freeze-framed. The growth in public housing has been minuscule. There's been a little bit more growth in community housing, but very small.
And we should just explain the difference between public housing, community housing and social housing, because we'll throw these terms around and they all have slightly different meanings. So do you want to just summarise what we mean by each of them?
So the umbrella term is social housing, and that includes the two types. Public housing is that delivered by the state housing authorities, basically. So still within government. Very transparent access arrangements, rent arrangements, reasons for eviction, all published. Community housing is a newer sector, able to do a lot more in an innovative sort of way, boutique sort of operations, but not to the sort of scale of public housing. So they tend to be not-for-profit run.
Yeah, run by not-for-profits. And we should also maybe just define the difference between social housing and affordable housing, because that's another term. So social housing, normally tenants pay a fixed proportion of their income in rent, normally 25%, that's right, isn't it?
25 to 30, yeah.
And they'll generally be people in receipt of Centrelink payments or pensions or things like that.
That's right. I think to qualify, you have to have at least $1 of assistance through Centrelink.
Whereas affordable housing, your rent would be pegged at a proportion of the prevailing private rental rate, so 80% normally of the prevailing rate for rental.
Yeah, that's right. And there's still a little bit of means testing, particularly coming in, that's applied to that to kind of match the supply up with the demand. But yeah, around 75-80%.
Okay, so your point was, why are we surprised?
Yeah, take your hands off the wheel, let it go, and this is what you get. Notable exceptions, there have been some attempts to intervene, but with a big issue like housing supply and demand, you need to do it in a more coherent way.
Brendan?
So I'd probably take a broader view on what the problems are. So homelessness is the really acute end where, quite frankly, this is what someone's life looks like for the next 5 years, whether they have a life beyond that time. It's an enormous problem and it is growing. But I would take a step back and say, well, look, the problems as we see them, I suppose, are one, first of all, housing's become really expensive to own or rent at a macro level. Peter, you mentioned before prices have been going up. They've been going up. Well, they went up and then they've come down, but they're still well above where they were even 5 years ago. They're in fact back to where I was when I bought. So we'll be interested to see what happens from here. So I am a homeowner and I should declare that interest. So you've got a problem where housing's become more expensive over the last 3 decades. It's become particularly expensive for low-income earners. So rents and rental costs at the lower end have risen faster than rental costs overall. And it's not surprising in a world where you've got housing becoming more expensive that the most vulnerable Australians struggle the most. And by that I mean those that are low-income earners that are in rental stress, that's gone up a lot. Because if you're in that situation, you just don't have the income to deal with that kind of cost. And then if you think of homelessness is caused by lots of different things, but a big structural factor is how much it costs. And it's no coincidence that homelessness is rising in Melbourne and Sydney where housing is most expensive. And so you've kind of got a combination of problems at the market level and then the adequacy of social supports that we're providing via government or via the community sector in order to assist people that find themselves on really hard times.
And I'm right in saying, I think, Arno, that rents have not been growing as fast as house prices, but they still have been growing much faster than wages or other cost of living, CPI and so on.
That's correct, and particularly at the bottom, that's where so low-income earners today are spending much more of their income on housing what they were a decade or two ago, whereas higher income earners are not. And it leads into questions like broader discussions around inequalities. So one of the things that we're seeing is income inequality isn't rising very much in the long run. It's actually the increases we're talking about are relatively small, but income inequality after housing costs are taken into account has risen a lot. So incomes have risen roughly equally across the distribution, but after you take into account housing, they've risen much more at the top than the bottom, and then you get to wealth, and then wealth inequality is a big issue.
There's a great little chart in the Grattan Orange book. I think that's where it was. Is that where I saw it, that shows that?
Well, this is the only time you'll ever see someone from Grattan speaking without charts, is at these events.
Yeah, so it's a great chart and well worth looking at. So what about other factors, Jenny and Heather, obviously the supply of affordable housing and the costs of rents are decisive factors, but there are other triggers that often lead to homelessness. What sort of factors lead to homelessness, and why are we, apart from the cost of housing, what else is going on here?
Well, I think we focus on those other issues that can lead people into homelessness a bit too much. We focus on people with long-term mental illness, substance misuse, acquired brain injury, the complexities of
Family
life.
violence is
Family violence is the biggest single driver of people presenting homeless to our services. But what those people all have in common is a reduced income. So if you've got a long-term mental illness, you are less likely to be able to participate in employment. A woman and children escaping family violence may have lost the income that allowed them to sustain that property, and in the working through of that homelessness be quite some time until they've got an income that could sustain private rental. If you've got those complexities, you're also much less likely to present well to a real estate agent or a private renter, someone who wants to rent a private property. And you are going to be at the bottom of the list of people being chosen. We see discrimination. We see around the country, 25% of those presenting to our homeless services are identify as having Aboriginal background, and we see discrimination of other people of colour, asylum seekers, refugees as well. All of those people are financially disadvantaged and also less likely to be seen as a safe bet by the private real estate market. It's about poverty. It's about disadvantage. It's not inherent in those complexities in life. All of those people can live well in the community. A very small number of people will need ongoing support to sustain housing once they've been able to actually get it. But it's a very small number of people. The support that's required is well understood. It's well demonstrated both in this country and internationally. We know how to do it. We haven't had those programs taken to scale, but the problem that our services have right around the country is they just cannot help people access housing that they can afford on an ongoing basis.
So I mean, all those problems you identified, substance abuse, mental illness, family violence, these have been around, right? But so the key issue for you is the supply of affordable social housing.
Someone with a long-term mental illness with some complexity associated with that can live very well in a private rental in the community if they can afford it, and if we have the support services that are available as they might need it from time to time.
So Heather, how well does the private rental market provide for people at the bottom in terms of income, or people with specific problems in their personal lives and complexities in their lives?
Well, I suppose one thing to say is that private rental is providing at least 30% of the housing now. And mostly that's actually well provided. Mostly that's well provided. The constraint, and it goes a bit to what Brendan was saying about the price problems, is what people on very low fixed incomes that aren't likely to improve, what they've got to choose from is often very mismatched to what they actually need. So rooming houses, for example, can be a reasonable housing option for people who've got somewhere to go during the day, other things in their lives, able to kind of share space. But people who've got bigger needs than that often find themselves in rooming houses, cheek by jowl with people that they're annoying and that get annoyed by, and off it goes. So they're the sort of ways that, the lower end of the market. And in Victoria and other jurisdictions, there's some stuff starting to happen around minimum standards, some of those things that might help some of that. But it really is that kind of, when you leave it all to choice and supply and demand, you're going to have problems. And
the cheapest housing will be further away from jobs, further away from transport, further away from services generally? There'll be something that makes it less desirable, and that goes to the price point. Down it goes, yeah. Brendan?
So I think one of the big challenges we face, and Grattan's published extensively on this problem, is that, we haven't been building enough. And one of the consequences of that is that everyone moves down. So, instead of living in Fitzroy, I might be living in Preston. Instead of someone living in Preston, they're living in Rosanna. Instead of living in Rosanna, they're living in Broadmeadows. People move down the list of quality of dimensions of housing by its price, because of, or as a result of, they move down quality, size, location, all of these things. And it's probably unsurprising that the people who end up hurt from that scenario are those with the lowest incomes. So I would distinguish between the kind of what are the housing needs of those that can be in the private rental market, as Heather says, which is the majority of the bottom 20% of income earners. So 2/3 are in the private rental market, and they've been in the private rental market that's been the case for the majority of the last 30 years. Or I think, in fact, for the last 30 years. And those that you need a bundle of services, a combination of a subsidy and maybe some support services and then security of tenure to make sure that you can survive well. And I think distinguishing between those two is really important, because we often end up in a debate that says, well, if we just give 800,000 affordable homes to everyone in the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%, then we'd solve the problem. And the trouble is that then you're talking about a cost that is just simply enormous.
So acknowledging that we have limited resources, then the question is, how do we prioritise, how do we target, and so on. Before we move on to looking at solutions, are there any other comments about, I suppose, drivers of increasing homelessness and vulnerability in housing, in precariousness in housing, from any of the panelists? Any particular groups you think? And we've already mentioned, of course, Indigenous Australians, much more likely to be sleeping rough, far more likely to be in overcrowded housing, far more likely to be homeless, and so on. But any other comments here?
Well, I think there's quite a bit of discussion in the community now about older people, and older women in particular, being more likely to find themselves homeless. And I think we are incredibly unprepared for that as a community, because our whole human services system, assumes that you will, grow up, go to work, buy a house, pay it off by the time you're retired, and be able to live modestly on the age pension. But
because the assumption of the age pension in Australia is that your housing costs are covered because you own your own home. It's more or less the underlying assumption.
Well, it has been, but I think we're going to increasingly find that people who own their own home are not going to be able to live modestly on the age pension, at the same time as increasingly people are retiring without being within cooee of owning their home, and many more as renters. And I think for me that it's a shocking development, but it also underlines that it is an economic, it is predominantly a price point problem. It's not so much about someone's challenge in sustaining a house. This is ordinary people women who've been in and out of the workforce, made a contribution in raising families, have earned less, have less superannuation because of that, and just don't have enough superannuation to be able to make the Australian dream work for them in their retirement.
So just to pick up on that, we've done quite a lot of research on home ownership. So home ownership is falling fast amongst the young and the poor, particularly amongst the poorest 20% of younger Australians. So, 3 in 5 used to own their own home. Now it's 1 in 5 of those aged 25 to 34 that are amongst the poorest 20% of that age group. And you see it right across the income distribution and the age distribution, that it used to be your chances of owning a home were pretty much the same, regardless of, for each age group, regardless of what your income was. So whether you're poor or wealthy. Now it's a really steep gradient, and we're seeing that feed into older cohorts, like 55, 64-year-olds. And we're projecting actually that home ownership amongst retirees could fall to just over 50% in 3 decades' time if the trends that we've seen over the last couple of decades continue. In just the fact that that's just building in the fact that younger people are so much less likely to own their home today, and just watching as they age. And so a lot of that's probably already priced in, it's already built in. There's also a really interesting difference between pensioners that own their own home today. Their rates of financial stress, the rates of things like not being able to afford a meal, are very low, incredibly low, lower than any other group in society, lower than working age Australians that have paid work, and certainly lower than anyone on Newstart. But those that rent are in trouble, and renters are in trouble when retirement, but they're especially in trouble while they're working. Or not working in this case. And I think, just finally, I just want to put planning back on the table as an issue, because supply, we can try to solve this problem, through subsidies and support, and government absolutely has a role to play, and, Grattan has said that before. But what worries me is, you end up in a world where we say all we have to do is just build more social housing. It'll cost a lot of money, and we ignore planning. So we know from the Reserve Bank research and others that it adds a lot to the cost of housing, both to rent or buy. And this is planning means that it's hard to build within 5 to 10 k's of the city centre. You look at Carlton, it's 2-storey terraces. Now, I loved when I lived there as a student. I certainly can't afford to live there now. And if across a lot of the inner cities of Melbourne and Sydney, the density's barely changed, and I think that's something that we have to think about. It's not just going to be solved by more government support.
So we might come back to the issue of planning in a moment, but I'm going to ask what might seem like a stupid question or even an insensitive question. And Brendan, you've earlier declared that you're a homeowner. I'm a homeowner as well, and I've done very well out of being a homeowner. I'll acknowledge that.
I think you probably paid a bit less than I did.
Well, I bought my house a lot earlier. So, my first house, I've got to say, and so I acknowledge that I've been incredibly lucky. And if you read my book, I argue that luck should be shared, but that's another matter. But why, and this is a question for everyone, why should homeowners care? Why should it be a matter for me as a homeowner to care about what happens to other people? I think there's a range of responses to that, but I just think we should put it out there on the table. Why do we care about this?
I'll start with that one. Well, homeowners really have to care, otherwise we'll get precisely nowhere. So that, for a start. I think many of us want a society that we feel is fair, that we don't feel is, we're getting more than someone else in an unfair manner. And I think a lot of us think like that. Typically the argument's put in terms of what about our children, or, those sort of arguments. And if you can only extend that feeling as far as your own immediate family, I suppose that's a good one. But
if you've done well out of housing, your immediate family will be fine.
Well, they will get a leg up. That's absolutely right, because you've got that to bank out. Yeah, that's right. But I would argue that there is that better side of Australians, and that needs to be appealed to a lot more, because who likes hearing about a young woman dying in a park? There are many people who die quietly, I can tell you from my time at Launch, that no one hears about. And there's many blighted lives and lost opportunities, and our whole society is not what it could be and should be, for want of this quite simple thing.
Well, I think we should care. I think there's a lag in the appreciation of our changing face of who we are as a community, and we still see ourselves as a land of home ownership, and if you work hard you'll get there, and the land of the fair go, where we're a relatively egalitarian society. But I think that has changed more already than we realise, and we're heading towards being a land of gated communities and ghettos. And, that changes the quality of life for us all. And I think we're on the verge of losing something very, very precious. That it's safely walking around our streets, the level of crime, the level of sense of belonging, and as compared to disenchantment of people in our community. I think it's really important, but it's slipping away from us.
Look, I'm an economist, so
I know
I'll start with self-interest, which is to say that the things that... So I agree with you. There's questions about, what kind of shared compact do we have in a society? What do we do for those that are struggling? And there's costs associated with not acting in that world. What I find in the public conversations we have, and we do a lot of media on these sorts of issues, and talk to a lot of people, and it tends to be, my kids can't afford a house at all, or they can't afford to live near where I do, and therefore they don't get to see I don't get to see my grandkids, is the line that we see resonating more than anything else. There are also, I think, you can appeal to self-interest in the way that you can solve some of these problems, not the question of funding social housing, but you can probably solve some of the questions around how expensive housing is in ways that benefit the community as a whole. But instead, the political dynamic is probably between those that already are happy with the amount of housing where they live and those that don't. So there's an economic benefit and a dividend from making housing more affordable. We see that from work from the United States. And then there is, and if we're able to build more housing close to jobs, then you would probably see the benefits of that too for everyone. So there's a self-interest argument there, self-interest argument in terms of home ownership and whether your kids can do it. And then there's, it is a values proposition about what sort of society we want to live in.
But it's also, as you're suggesting there, about the efficiency of there's a kind of productivity efficiency argument here too, that the way our housing system is at the moment is not actually good for the economy.
Yeah, people are further from work. They're further from, that means labour force participation is lower. We know that it's lower, particularly for secondary income earners further out. So if you're in Point Cook, for example, your labour force participation as the second earner in a household is lower materially than if you're in Fitzroy, because it's literally harder to get around. And it also affects the cost of provision of infrastructure. So it's cheaper to build the infrastructure typically in the inner city. Infrastructure Victoria did really good work on that recently than it is to try to build it further out.
Okay, well, let's turn to what needs to be done or what should be done or how we should prioritise what should be done. And, we've just been through a federal election campaign, and as part of that campaign, there was the Everybody's Home campaign, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. And that was basically arguing that governments need to build a lot more social housing. Is that the most urgent thing? How much would we need to build? What would it cost? Jenny, do you want to start on that?
Look, from our point of view, it's the single most important thing that we need to do as a community. We need to recognise that, we've had decades of prosperity and growth and relying on the market to provide the housing market to provide for the whole community, and it just hasn't. And, it's been at least 3 decades since government started getting out of the business of providing social housing in a comprehensive way. Initially it was provided to make sure that workers could live close to the factories in which they work, so it was sort of affordable housing. But the private sector is not going to make housing available for people on low incomes. There's no money in it. And I think many a scheme has been devised for somehow the private sector to produce housing for the most disadvantaged, and I think there probably are ways of funding affordable housing.
So affordable meaning
80%
for sort of
market
key
rent
workers,
for key workers to make
nurses
sure,
and teachers and baristas and
make sure that people can live close enough to where they work. But I have looked everywhere all over the world for a model whereby that could magically be done without government putting its hand in its pocket for a subsidy, and I haven't found it anywhere.
So on the question of, say, the homeless population of Australia, we've got 116,000. I agree. You're not going to...
A night.
Sorry?
A night.
Yes. You're not going to get the market rent housing to solve that problem. That is clearly a problem that needs a subsidy because people are suffering from a lack of income and then other supports. But I would distinguish with low-income earners in general because there are countries in the world that do have very affordable housing. So the classic case is Japan that's built an enormous amount of housing. Housing is relatively cheap and people on the whole seem to be pretty well housed. Whereas I'd contrast that with something like San Francisco, which I saw in one report recently was being held up as an example of a place where, affordable housing policy was being done really well. Because look at all those affordable housing units and, San Francisco has the worst housing outcomes of any city in the US because it's impossible to build there. So when it comes to Australia's homeless population, how to help people who are suffering from homelessness, absolutely social housing. But I think when it comes to what you do for low-income earners, the social housing stock never made up more than 5 or 6% of the overall stock. So if 3 decades ago things were better and they're not now, I struggle to see how social housing alone is not going to solve that problem. So, but the share of social housing has diminished considerably. It was more like 7% and now it's more like 4%, right? It's fallen from 6 to 4 on our numbers. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Heather, your views on this? Social housings are fundamental. I suppose I'd
put in a word for what's starting to happen, which is that private rental being recognised as something that is here to stay, that needs to be have serious policy made about it. Here we are in Victoria in the midst of the rental reforms. Some of the fundamental ones are the removal of no reason notices to vacate. It's not happened yet, but it's on its way. Some of the features that make social housing desirable, actually, are things like certainty, non-discriminatory access, predictable rents, which private rental's nowhere near yet. But some of the things that make for that desirability of social housing, I think we need to think how we can actually manage to build
How
into
do you
private
get that
rental.
in the...
Yeah.
So do you know of anywhere where the private rental market, any international examples where the private rental market provides well for people on low incomes without a government subsidy or without social housing?
Oh, not without a government subsidy on very low incomes, no. I mean, that's just maths. Yeah.
But there are countries where you have a subsidy and then that subsidy is then sufficient to get people out of housing stress.
That's right.
So you need a combination for those at the bottom. You need a subsidy, whether it's rent assistance, which has been underfunded. So the fact that it's indexed to CPI rather than rents means it's lost something like 20% of its real value just in the last 15 years.
Well, the UK, for example, I'm not quite sure where they're up to now, but they had a top-up. So it was actually your income, what you could spend, plus what your rent was, the middle was given as the subsidy. So it's a much smarter way to do it.
So let's just stick with, let's come back to rent assistance, but stick with public housing or social housing. So Brendan, your argument is that we should be, if we do need to build more social housing, but it should be targeted at the most needy, so those people currently who are homeless or at risk of homelessness and who... Is there a problem here, though, because social housing in Australia has become residualised, if I can use that term? It has become seen as as housing of last resort, where people with the most complex problems are concentrated, and therefore, and I'm not saying this is a fair characterisation, by the way, and therefore is undesirable, and therefore it lacks political support, as in it's not popular, it's not... Is there a problem here in saying, well, it's only for the people at the very bottom that you end up, in a way, ghettoising social housing as a very niche area that is welfare only and therefore has a very bad reputation?
So, look, these are difficult trade-offs. So the first thing I would say is that, we know, as you mentioned before, we know that a housing first strategy would work. Finland's done it. Other countries have done it.
So we should just explain housing first as a concept.
Well, actually, you're probably a better place to do that than I am.
So standard approaches to how homelessness would take a staircase approach. So let's help you sort out your finances and your, let's say, substance abuse problems so that you are in a situation where you can sustain a tenancy in the private market. Housing first strategy turns that on its head and say, let's get you housed first and then we can think about all your other problems, because until we get you into secure housing, it's not really realistic to ask you to address those other problems. And so that Finland has been extremely successful with that housing first approach.
So on that basis, though, the risk with housing first in Australia is that we build the houses or we fund it and we don't give them to those that are most needy. And the reason I say that is because there's any moral framework would normally say, look, if there are people who are literally going to die if we do not support them, and we're talking about life and death decisions here for people. If we're not going to assist them first, that in any moral framework seems to me more important than helping those that are just in housing stress, given a constrained amount of money. Then, given how expensive this is, so if we're going to build 100,000 social housing units, it'll cost something like $1 billion a year to keep them on the market, or an upfront capital cost of $10 to $15 billion. We built during the global financial crisis about 20-odd thousand, and it cost us $4 to $5 billion. So, when we move from a 6% of the social housing stock to 4%, to get us back to 6% today would be 200,000 units. That's either $2 billion a year, each and every year. That's how much, your negative gearing and capital gains tax changes would have saved the budget.
Would have.
Or an upfront capital cost of something like $20 billion, which is, quite frankly, enormous. And so what's, I think, feasible in the political world that we live in is that, and perhaps probably potentially desirable for how you best target support is to help those that are really struggling. And it doesn't necessarily mean that all the housing has to be next to one another. That's not what we're talking about. So you're talking about giving someone a social housing unit who doesn't have one now. That could be as part of a community housing organisation where there's now 3 more people on the block, or it could be as part of what community housing organisations do elsewhere, or just in the general community. I think people think of that and go straight to, we're going to build another tower in Fitzroy. And that's not, I think, what most people mean, and certainly not what we mean when we say build more or fund more social housing for the bottom.
Jenny, Heather, shouldn't we be ambitious and say, actually, we should be spending $20 billion? We have to mount the political case for that and win the political argument, but isn't that do you think that's where we should be heading? Or do we say, well, what's realistic? We might get, the state government here has promised $209 million for 1,000 housing units over some period of time. How hard do you push, and what do you accept as kind of minimal?
Well, one of the great problems is really getting someone to step forward and take the baton on it. Finland, which has been cited a bit, has a national leadership on this. Victoria needs to do what Victoria can do. The City of Melbourne, similarly, developers who have got the will to put a proportion of affordable housing in. But it all needs to be sewn together at a national level in Australia. And one of our great impediments, I think, is the Commonwealth state sort of situation, and then local government is another one, and not-for-profits swimming around in that particular soup. And I think that if someone actually really steps forward and takes leadership on it and has a look at the matter, then, but how you do that, I have not managed to sort of crack, apart from, I suppose, Kevin Rudd was the closest, and he had a personal experience of homelessness as a child and felt very strongly about it.
We've got a Prime Minister who used to work for the Property Council, knows a bit about housing.
That's true. Yeah, you never know.
So in terms of ambition, I don't know how many people know, but we had a major political party at the last election go to an election promising implicitly to spend $30 billion on affordable housing. That was the scope of the commitment from Labor.
So this was Labor's affordable housing strategy, which promised essentially a kind of reboot of NRAS, the National Rental Affordability Scheme, but with some changes. That was my understanding of it.
Yeah, so I think what's striking of the things that, say, the Everybody's Home campaign wanted, they got the one that I think was the least important and didn't get the others that probably mattered a lot more. Because the reason why I say that is that $30 billion was to provide affordable housing at 20% below market rents.
Not social housing. Important distinction.
And the really important point there is that by doing that, you're not going to be able to, someone who is homeless or long-term homeless is not going to be able to survive in 20% below market rents. It's just not the type of housing you need. And that $30 billion, if we put that towards social housing, that's your 200,000 units over 20 years. That what the sector's wanting. And I think one of the big risks, and that would have been potential tragedies of affordable housing policy in Australia, is we would do NRAS rather than building more social housing.
Jenny, is that your view?
Look, yes. However, I think there's also the opportunity for states and territories to step up and match that and turn it into social housing, and perhaps a federal government and state and territory governments put even a little bit more in to provide that support. I do think it is about priorities as well. We can, as a community, spend $50 billion building submarines and, $17 billion buying planes, defence planes, Striker jets. But, they're not the conversations we have, in the build-up to elections. The only other comment I'd like to make is that Finland have achieved this in 2 ways. One is that they guarantee the rents of people who qualify for social housing to 80%. And if you've got extraordinary complexity in your life, it's possible to have it 100% guaranteed. That, in combination with giving community housing a guarantee to back up their loans, provides everyone with the confidence to go ahead and build that affordable housing, knowing that they will be able to get a social rent where that's relevant. Now, we're a long way from that, but I think it's a model that we should bear in mind as we row forward.
And does it matter whether this housing is built as public housing, that is through state or authorities owned by the state, or provided, through the community housing sector? Because that's a pretty vociferous debate. I mean, there are some people say it should be the state, it should be public. Others who say, well, community housing is more in touch with it's less bureaucratic, it's more nimble, it's more in touch with its residents and so on. What are your views on that?
As long as you have non-discriminatory access, security of rents, security of tenure, good quality provision, guaranteed. And I suppose people are more familiar with public housing and how you achieve that. And they don't tick off all those characteristics, all of the public housing units, especially the kind of standard that's been let fall.
Because a lot of them are very old and very run down now, and
Yeah.
inappropriate in terms of disability access and all sorts of things.
That's it. Yeah, they've outlived what they were meant to be for. So as long as you have that, I'm really kind of, don't mind myself. But that's the guarantee that people need, and we're talking about people who don't feel they have much power to exact that guarantee.
I think we're still undertaking our research on which is probably better. The impression I have is that you can be relatively neutral between the two, but the way in which you fund them matters a lot. So, something like NRAS, the original NRAS, provided about $11,000 a year for 10 years to affordable housing providers and private investors to build housing that was rented out 20% below market rents. That subsidy was $11,000 a year, and the benefit that the Commonwealth got for its money in terms of the 20% discount was only about $3.5. You kind of wonder, why are we doing it that way? So I'm relatively agnostic at the moment between those two options, but it would strike me it will probably be a lot more cost effective if you just got the states to build it, because there's no risk of leakage. There's no risk of someone taking a profit on the way through, which I think is what we saw with NRAS, is that it ended up, there was tradable markets in the incentives. People were developers were buying up those incentives and then using them to help sell student apartments that they'd built already.
Yeah. But particularly this is certainly research by AHURI, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, suggests that the most cost-effective way to build is for governments simply to borrow and build, especially given the cost of capital to governments is low, particularly at the moment. That's certainly one argument. Whether it's then run by the state or run by community housing is another. I'm going to invite questions from the floor, but before we do that, I want to come to one other thing which has been mentioned but not discussed, and that's Commonwealth rent assistance. One of the hidden tricks in giving or allowing community housing providers to run the housing is that you're cost shifting to the Commonwealth, because a resident in community housing gets rent assistance, a resident in state-run public housing does not. So there's a little bit of cost shifting going on there. Commonwealth rent assistance has gone up over the past 10 years from around $2.4 to $4.4 billion. And that is despite the fact that it's capped at low rates, that has risen much slower than rents. And it is going to go up a lot more. We are going to spend a lot on CRA, because there's going to be more and more people going on the pension and being in the private rental market because they don't own their homes. So how effective is Commonwealth rent assistance? How useful is it as a way of addressing these problems? What's your views on Commonwealth rent assistance?
You couldn't withdraw it tomorrow, is one thing. But in terms of well-targeted and effective, I think it's got a long way to go. Yeah.
Because?
It's too low, it's too broad, it's not targeted at the people who really need it and in that deeper way, like the UK one that I cited before. But having implemented it, I think it was the beginning of the 90s it came in, how you back it out, a very good question. And it was, I believe, inflationary of rents when it first came in.
Our view is that Centrelink incomes are way too low, and the rental assistance, as Brendan said earlier, is completely lost touch with what it's the job it's meant to do. But if that happens without an increase in supply, then it's going to be reasonably ineffectual.
Look, I've got a more positive view of rent assistance. I think for a couple of reasons. One, it's not that well targeted, but it's a hell of a lot better, better targeted than something like affordable housing. So about a quarter of people in low income renters, a quarter of renters in Australia can get rent assistance, whereas say half of Australians are actually eligible for a dwelling through NRAS, because the caps are $50,000 for a single or $70,000 for a couple. Now, you cannot get Commonwealth rent assistance when you're on those kind of incomes. And so, one thing that rent assistance does is it doesn't mean you're giving key worker accommodation to nurses and teachers, who I understand there might be an economic argument for giving them that support, but they tend to be in the top half of the income distribution. If we're thinking really clearly and careful about who we want to help, they're not near the bottom, and therefore probably wouldn't be the first in the queue. The other reason I think rent assistance works is because it's pretty fair. You get the same amount regardless of where you go. And that means that people can choose how much they want to spend on housing. And, rent assistance itself, we say it should rise by 40%. We don't think that would be very inflationary to rents because, the rental market is $50 billion a year. The rental market at the bottom is $20 billion amongst the bottom 40%. You're only talking about $1 billion a year that you're giving out, and people don't have to spend it on housing. In fact, they kind of can't unless they move. And the big difference is that in the countries where the rent assistance is given to the landlord, you see most of it ends up in rents because the landlord is making the call, well, you can afford this now. I'll just take that money. Thank you very much. When the rent assistance is given to the individual, most of the literature says the impact on rents would be 1 or 2% most, because you can only spend more on housing if you actually move house. I lived on rent assistance for a while. That was just part of my income from Centrelink, and I was a student, so it probably didn't go on housing.
I mean, and I'll invite. We've got a couple of microphones now. If you've got a question you'd like to ask or a comment you'd like to make, I'd ask you to keep it concise. I don't mind comments, but keep them concise so the panel can respond and so we can get to as many people as possible. And I'll just, while we're getting the microphone to people, just one other comment though. I mean, landlords get rent assistance and they don't have to do anything for it, right? It's a subsidy to landlords, even though it's indirect. Landlords don't have to draft proof. They don't have to make sure that the heating works. They don't have to do anything else for this essentially subsidy from taxpayers to landlords, along with negative gearing and all the rest of it.
Well, I don't think it is a subsidy to landlords. I think it ends up in the pockets of the renter. And we have rules around, the tenancy standards, as ineffective or inadequate as they might be, that are around trying to make sure those other things take place.
Well, we will have. You still don't have to have a heater.
So Heather, your point would be that we also need to have higher standards in the private rental market.
Absolutely.
Okay, we've got a couple of hands up here. Yep. We'll start with you. Yep.
This discussion reminds me of the one where I was taking part in 1961. Very little difference. We had the same problem then, and we have the same problem today. And in Australia, our main problem is the vicious Stalinist governments we have. For the first time in my life, I voted Liberal. Why?
Can you ask a question or make a comment?
Why?
Quick? Yeah.
Because of the attack by the state government on boarding houses, building the most vulnerable people, and nobody wants uneducated, ugly people in their streets. So they're attacking boarding houses to the nth degree, and for the people who are at the bottom. And this problem is only it's in the Parliament over there.
Okay,
they pass it.
All right,
that's what the problem is.
Okay, I'll take that as a comment.
Well, I do think it is getting worse. I mean, homelessness has gone up 30% in the last 10 years. So while, we have always had homelessness, I think it's the numbers and the seriousness of disadvantage and the lack of hope in actually obtaining housing that people can afford is increasing.
Okay, and there's a great book called Housing the Australian Nation, written in 1942, which my friend here, Rob Pradlin, lent to me, which suggests that there are a whole lot of commonalities. And it's that key point, the market will not provide for those at the bottom. We can't expect it to. Subsidised housing requires a subsidy. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, hello. I just had a question about, from a lot of the research I've done, there seems to be the issue of like the inflation of housing for the entire Australian society is problematic. It's not just, I mean, it's obviously really bad for the lower end, but it's having these horrible economic knock-on effects. We're at this stranglehold point where if the market continues to go up, it's going to further and further cause all the gaps between the haves and have-nots. But then if it goes down, then you run into the issues of people who are in the market falling into negative equity and having a big economic, downfall. How do you think we could sort of straddle that fence?
Okay. So this is the issue, right? That homeowners want their housing values to go up. And if they don't, then recent entrants to the market are underwater. And we have massive levels of household debt in Australia. So we create the risk of a financial crisis if house prices go down too much. But the more they go up, the worse the situation gets. It's been described as the game of homes by one analyst. I regard it a bit as like a Ponzi scheme. This is really, now my argument would be change the tax settings on housing, but I don't know what other people think. Yep, get rid of stamp duty, replace it with a progressive broad-based property tax that would capture capital gains. Yep.
So one point would be you're always going to have housing cycles. They're always going to go up and down. The fact that it's interesting that this time around, I've never seen a housing downturn in Australia that's been so celebrated by the Australian policy class as what we've seen over the last 18 months. So, the Reserve Bank governor I don't get the impression that he's particularly worried about falling house prices. What he's worried about is the fact that the economy is performing under, the inflation's below target and unemployment's rising. And so they're interested in cutting interest rates because they need to out of necessity. And we're trying to use macroprudential rules to try to make sure that doesn't reinflate the market. I think there is, at the heart of it, a trade-off that younger Australians can't win unless someone loses. So prices do have to fall in the long run. But what we've tended to find in the past is that prices have come down suddenly a bit, and then they've often just flatlined for a decade. And that's actually how we've improved affordability in the past. And, when you look around the world at countries that have quite affordable housing now, like Japan, it started with a crisis. But the thing is that prices never went back up and they stayed where they are. And so I think you can do it in a way that doesn't necessarily blow up the economy, but it's probably part of it's a financial cycle, which is what we've had. And then part of it's just, reform planning rules, you maybe fix the tax system. Those things would mean that house prices don't rise as quickly, and they may fall relative to inflation in the long run. And that to me would be the best outcome. And rents would fall, which is actually, I think, the main game when we're talking about, the kind of people we're talking about tonight that are really struggling.
I mean, I think it is remarkable in this country that there actually isn't any policy granting government. I mean, we do now have a Minister for Housing for the first time since the previous Labor government. We've got an Assistant Minister for Homelessness, but we don't have any national plan in relation to homelessness or housing. And so we tend to have a series of discussions, as Peter has done very systematically tonight, about all of the variables that are involved, but we don't have any discussion about how we might put them all together to deal with this in a way that leads to a soft landing and, views housing as social infrastructure that's important to our overall well-being and monitors all those different variables as they go up and down with a view to showing leadership and making sure that we can house everyone in Australia as well as not have our biggest market fall over. And there doesn't seem to be any will to do that. There doesn't seem to be any sense that that's something we should do as a country. And until we do, we'll just keep going round and round, as the gentleman said over there, with the conversation that we have been having in some ways for a very long time.
And it's very hard to change because 65% of Australians own their own homes and have an interest in the values of their homes going up and up. So next question, thanks.
Hello. I would like to know what the panellists think about local government's role in providing affordable housing. Like, what do they see their role is in this space?
I think local government probably proportionately, in many cases, does more than its counterparts. I think because it's so proximate to the problem. I mean, we're sitting here in the city of Melbourne, which is contributing to the social safety net with actual funding, with coordination, um, locating land that can be used for social housing, all those sort of things. So I suppose my point is that every level of government and every kind of sector has to do their bit. And as Jenny so eloquently put it, if it was only under this umbrella of actual coordination and planning, I think we'd get somewhere. So local government's certainly got a role because it knows a lot and can do a few things, but it doesn't have most of the levers.
I think national coordination's overrated. I think, well, we probably haven't had a lot of it, but I actually think it's over.
Give it a try.
Well, I think if you have a national housing strategy, what's it going to do? So the thing that I think would make the most difference to the cost of housing in Australia is actually the local government level. It's the planning rules that make it really hard to build housing where people want to live. We know that that's correlated really closely with levels of income. So higher income areas of cities tend to make it harder for people to be able to subdivide and build apartments, which quite frankly is what we're looking at, apartments and townhouses. Density in Melbourne and Sydney in the inner suburbs has barely moved. When we talk about a national housing strategy, I think what you're giving governments an out, because it's actually really easy to create a national housing strategy. You just have a press release that has national housing strategy on it. I'm just being flippant, I'm sorry. But the levers for the supply side are at the state and the local level. And what the Commonwealth, I think we should be clear what the national government can do is it can provide funding for social housing, and it can fix aspects of the tax system. It will make a difference, but I think that's also overrated. I don't think that reforms to negative gearing would have made that much difference to the housing market.
Maybe not negative gearing, but what about capital gains tax, and what about a shift from stamp duty to broad-based property tax, which only the national government can coordinate to bring all the states on board? It's a very big agenda. It's like competition policy reform and so on. But Heather, I cut you off.
Oh, post-war reconstruction.
Just put the microphone.
Post-war reconstruction was when the national government last stepped in big time, and that's when we got a whole lot of social housing. There were small efforts locally before that. Here comes the historian. In Finland, it's national. New Zealand are making moves. Canada's making moves. The old kind of paper national housing strategy. There you go. Press release done. Of course, no one needs one of those. I think from my many years of observation, that you do actually have to, leadership is required, and that's where we need it to not only come from, but it does have to be partly there.
Sorry, Heather, I'm being flippant. I suppose the one thing I would say in response is that back in the 50s and 60s, we had an enormous increase in demand for housing. We had record levels of population growth into Australia. Our cities in Melbourne and Sydney were booming. We also relaxed rules around how much you could borrow. There was an incredible additional amount of demand for housing. And what happened to house prices? They didn't move. What did we do? We built an enormous amount of housing. So the kinds of constraints that now exist on the housing market on the supply side didn't exist 3 decades ago. And so obviously it's not the whole solution, but I think that's the thing that would make the most difference, and it's not at a national level unless you get the Commonwealth to fund it, to bribe the states to do it. And that's essentially, they've got the money, but they don't have the power to make it happen.
That's true. And I mean, I take your point about we built a lot of housing. We also built a significant amount of social housing during that period, which is what we've stopped doing.
I mean, just to come back to the initial comment about local government, I mean, in the time that I've been watching, there's a bit of a ping pong between local government not feeling empowered to, require social housing or affordable housing as part of developments, and wanting leadership from state government, and state government saying, oh, we can't really do that. It needs to happen at the local level. And I do think, I agree with Brendan, the state government should do that. It should take the lead, but then local governments will have to grapple with the political ramifications of that, and the impact. There's a lot about not in my backyard, and make sure that every time we do a housing development or redevelopment, there is a component of affordable and social housing in it, because that's the only way we're not going to keep slipping further behind.
So we have more questions? Yep. Go for it.
Oh, hi. Thanks for the stimulating.
Just bring that microphone closer. Point it right at your mouth.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for the stimulating discussion. I'd like you to comment on what's happening here in Victoria. Whereas in European countries, the proportion of public housing to total housing is around 15 to 20%, 17% in the UK. Here in Victoria, it's the state where the percentage is lowest, 4.2. And what is the state government doing? It's expropriating 70% of public housing estates, giving them to private developers and rebuilding public housing with less tenants than there were before on those estates.
Okay, so this is Victoria's public housing renewal program, very controversial. And Jenny, maybe you can start with your response to this, which does involve some sale of public lands to private developers and so on.
Yes, I mean, you're right. The basic model is, as I understand it, is for government to, sell the property to private developers, and the return being that the number of public housing units is uplifted by at least 10% in the rebuilt development. And I think it is pretty tough to think about, if you like, selling off the farm in order to get that new fabric and that uplift in the number of properties and more appropriate properties in terms of singles and doubles, which is what we're very, very short of in our community. But the Council to Homeless Persons and the other peaks in Victoria that are very concerned about housing for people on our lowest incomes have resigned ourselves to this approach, because we do need to replace all this aged public housing that we have, and if we require government to do it, it'll take every effort that they have. We won't get any additional social housing stock, and we'll continue to go backwards at the greatest rate of knots. So I'm very sympathetic to the point you're making, but we have accepted that this is the way it has to be.
Sort of better than nothing. Is that what you're saying?
The properties that we're talking about are continually going offline because they're just not suitable for habitation. They're in terrible state. They do have to be rebuilt. How a state government would find the money to do that without any help from anywhere else is hard to fathom.
Yes, question down the front.
Hi.
Keep that
I'm
microphone
a baby
close.
boomer.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm a baby boomer, so I'm actually very lucky. But I want to go back 30, 35 years and I'll follow up from the speaker, the person there, about Collingwood, high-rise, apartments. The government at the time wanted to get rid of all the people out of that, but where they want to send them is way out where there was no rails. And actually the government at the time, local government, did stop that. But what I was really angry about the Carlton, that they actually sold off to developers, and then they've got more private and low income, but they didn't make up those apartments for low income that they actually gave to the private sector. And I'm furious about what's happening around inner Melbourne with high rise. And it's got to be planning, and it's both sides of government. It's state, it's federal, it's Labor and Liberal. They really have to take responsibility for it. So it's a comment.
I think the only thing I'd say about the renewal program in Victoria is that it feels very opaque. So I, in principle, don't have an issue with, if we choose to sell off public land, we get a really good return for it, and it allows us to leverage, increase the amount of stock. I am not worried up front about that, but what I worry about is what we're getting for it, and the question is, are we actually getting value for money out the other end? Because one piece of land is fungible to another. You could buy one slot and sell another, sell one plot and buy another. But what worries me is the fact that I don't think we actually know what we got in some cases for the money.
And it's land you can only sell once. I mean, it's a government asset, and while land is fungible, this is well-located land in the inner city. It's a one-off opportunity. That would be my comment on that. Question over here.
I just want to raise the issue, go back to taxation, which I think is a major variable in all of this. Notwithstanding the Labor Party's direction, and I think the mistake they made about franking credits and making them retrospective, but the rest I agree with. And I think they would have made a difference. I don't agree with the Grattan representative. I think combined, as you said. But there's one thing we haven't talked about, and that is the value of houses in regard to the pension. You can have a $2 million, $3 million house, owner-occupied, and have $800,000 in the bank or in your super and still get the pension or access to a part pension. And my question, probably particularly to the Grattan representative, is I gather overseas, this is necessarily so, even in the US, that owner-occupied housing is taken into account in the assets test. So this, if that's true, this is another variable that makes the Australian system very loaded to my generation as a grandparent. Or isn't it going to be terrible that our children and our grandchildren won't get enough money in their inheritance? This is the theme, wasn't it, in the last election? It's pathetic. It's pathetic.
So this is actually one of my favourite hobby horses. So we do a lot of work on retirement incomes policy. We are in a world where most people own their own home. The fact that only the first $200,000 of the value of the home is included in the assets test, and the rest of it is by definition exempt. So, my grandfather in Bendigo, the same amount of his house, $200,000, is included in the assets test as someone in Toorak. That's manifestly unfair. But it probably didn't matter quite as much in a world where the housing haves and have. There was mainly housing haves in retirement and few have-nots. We're moving to a world where half of older Australians won't own their own homes, and that manifest distinction is going to become much sharper. And so the natural thing to do is to switch it around and say anything worth more than, say, $500,000 is included in the assets test. Now, look, at Grattan, we're happy to be bold, but even we're not saying include it from the first dollar. And I don't think after what happened with franking credits in the election, anyone's necessarily going to do that in the near term. But it is going to be a challenge we're going to have to confront. So, can I imagine it happening in the next 5 years? Well, probably not. But will something have to happen in the next 20? I'd say the answer is yeah. We're going to have to deal with that. Now, on negative gearing and CGT, we think they're good reforms. We supported them. The reason why I don't think it would make much difference to housing markets is it's $3 billion a year at the value of the tax break in a $6.6 trillion housing market. It's just tiny. It's 1% to 2% of prices. That's what we said, the Commonwealth Treasury, the New South Wales Treasury and others. And so I think I think the main benefits of those reforms are the budgetary benefits, that the money can be used better in other places.
Okay, look, thank you for all your... Oh, we're going to take one more? Okay, we'll take one more question. Thanks.
Thanks. I'd like to go back to Jenny's point about the new Minister for Housing. So Michael Sakar made headlines recently or last year when he said that the best way to get yourself a house was to have a high-paying job. This kind of comment suggests to me that there's a lack of political will to reduce housing inequality. And I guess what will it take? What do we need to see? And I guess more directed at you, Brendan, the home loan deposit scheme that the federal government put out recently, which I saw you commented on quite profusely. So that was very interesting. But are you, like me, concerned that might lead to more people becoming in mortgage stress because they're actually borrowing too much money, especially if housing prices do drop?
Well, let me start with the first home deposit scheme. So I think it's going to be relatively ineffective. It's capped at 10,000 people a year. It'll probably mainly help those that were going to buy a house anyway. They got to a 5% deposit. That's all you need to get to, and then you can borrow to buy a house, and you don't have to pay lender's mortgage insurance, which you would normally have to pay if you're borrowing less than 20%. It's only 10,000 people a year. Most of them would have got it anyway, even if every single person on that scheme would never have otherwise bought a house without that intervention. After a decade, the home ownership rate in Australia would be 1% higher. So it's going to be small. I'm not as worried, while the scheme's uncapped, that it's going to have much of an impact on people getting into mortgage stress because they can't afford their homes, because people who are marginal borrowers are getting kicked out by the fact that we have these quite stringent serviceability rules and which require you to make sure that the banks are required to make sure you can repay your loan given current income and expenditure at an interest rate of 7% now. It'll probably be more like 6.25% after some changes APRA puts through. I don't think it's going to have much of an impact. But the broader point here that scheme illustrated is you're pretending somewhat that first-time buyers can win and younger Australians can win without someone losing. And it's pretending that you can use the demand side of the market in order to fix the problem, when in reality, what we've done in Australia is we haven't been upfront with the public about what it's going to take, and we've been telling people it's okay, we'll be able to fix the problem. Here's another scheme that sounds good but doesn't make much of a difference. That's going to solve the problem. And the problem with that is that you don't fix the problem, so it gets worse, but you also don't front with the public what it's going to take. And then those broken promises about what it's going to take, on what the effects are of the policy you put in place is, end up reducing faith in government in the long term.
So let me ask for responses from Heather and Jenny too. On the other part of that question is, what will it take for us to address housing inequality in Australia? I mean, you know, the attempts by the Labor Party at the last election failed for whatever reason, whether it was franking credits or something else. So for now, those reforms, negative gearing reforms and capital gains tax reforms, are off the agenda. So what will it take, do you think, to start addressing this problem in a meaningful way? Even if we're just thinking about, as Brendan put it, the premise of the people that in most need, you know, who really need social housing, who are homeless or at risk of homelessness.
Well, to start to improve rental law, it took a significant increase in the number of renters who vote. So it's going to take a significant increase in the number of people who say, this is an important issue to me. I want my elected representative to do something about it. I think it's as simple as that and as hard as that.
Yeah. Jenny?
Well, I fear the homelessness problem will have to become a great deal worse, and I fear that it will lead to social unrest. Certainly in Los Angeles, I think they increased the sales tax there voluntarily as a community by 0.5% or something like that, in order to deal with the homelessness on their streets, the palpable rough sleeping, and the community came together around that. I would like to think in Australia we could have a sophisticated discussion about the choices we are making and the choices that we should be making, but there's not a lot of sign of it yet.
Okay, so thank you for your questions, for your attendance here this evening. A reminder that a podcast and transcript of this event will be posted on the Grattan Institute website in due course, and you can subscribe on the website to the Grattan newsletter and for updates about future events and Institute's new research and so on. But please join me now in thanking our three panellists, Jenny Smith, Heather Holst and Grattan.